Hello. In this video, I want to talk about political socialization and also discuss the topic of public opinion polling. So, political socialization is the process by which a person develops their political beliefs. So, it is a lifelong process. The opinions that people have about politics don't just come up one day when somebody wakes up and they decide I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. It's really a result of lifetime experiences. And for example, certainly your family, your parents have the biggest impact on your beliefs, but you also learn about political ideas and values at school, through your religion, through your neighbors, through your friends, your coworkers, in lots of different ways. In the reading, there's a discussion of the agents of socialization. That those are the people or institutions that shape your beliefs. So whether it's your family and your parents, which are the strongest agents, or some of the others we've talked about, the media would be one. Opinion leaders like the president. These are all ways that we acquire our beliefs. There's also the idea that you look at things from a frame of reference, kind of your background, so your income level, your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your religion are all factors that can shape the way you look at politics. Now, in terms of how we measure opinion, how do we measure what people are thinking? The main way that is done is through public opinion polls or public opinion surveys. And there's a lot of discussion in Chapter 6 about how we measure opinion. So please make sure you read those pages carefully. I know a lot of times people are kind of leery of polls, or they don't trust that they're actually accurate, or sometimes somebody might say, well, I've never been contacted to participate in a survey, so how do I know that these are accurate results? Well, we don't know for sure that they are accurate, 100% accurate. In fact, they usually are not 100% certain about the opinion of people. But if a polling organization uses a statistically valid method of interviewing people, they usually are pretty close in their results to what the general public thinks. But the thing to understand is that you really can never interview everybody in a population. If you're talking about a national survey, a population would be the entire country. If it's a statewide survey, then it's everyone in that state. But you really can never interview everybody in that population, just given the numbers. And so a polling organization will interview a sample of people. A sample is a subset of the population, a smaller group from within that population who are interviewed. In order to take the results of your sample and generalize them to the broader population, the sample must be chosen at random from the population. And randomness is a measure of statistics. We say random probability sample is the best way to do it, so that anyone within that population should have about the same chance of being picked as anyone else. Now, it's never going to be exactly equal in terms of how people are chosen, but the idea is that there has to be a way of just picking people at random. Random always means that people have an equal chance of being picked. A way of thinking about randomness is the lottery. When lottery numbers are drawn, anybody with a ticket in the lottery is going to have the same chance as anyone else with a ticket in the lottery, because there's a random procedure for drawing numbers. Now, the more in a random survey, the idea is that if there has to be a random way of doing it, it's typically done by telephone. Although certainly polling organizations now can use computers, they can contact people at random over the computer, but typically it's done by telephone because almost everyone has a telephone or access to a telephone. These days, of course, it's mostly cell phones, particularly for younger people, but there are people who still have landlines. Now, when a polling organization is contacting people, say by telephone, they might use a computer or some other way of randomly picking phone numbers so that anyone with a telephone number has a chance of being picked. Now, one of the problems that exists today is that so many people don't answer the phone if they don't recognize the phone number. That used to not be a problem. 30 or 40 years ago, people either didn't have caller ID, or if they did, they still picked it up. But today, we all have the ability to see who's calling us. And if we see a private number or a number we don't recognize, oftentimes we just don't answer the phone. And so polling organizations are having a harder time getting people to answer. Now, an appropriate sample size for a national survey is between 1,000 to 2,000 people. And statistically, it's that if you interview about 1,000 to 2,000 people from a population, you're going to get pretty close to the broader population because you're getting a good cross section of people of different races and religions and genders and ethnicities and sexual orientations and income levels and education levels. Because as the book discusses, the authors in your book discuss, there are differences in how people think. There are differences between races and religions and genders and ethnicities and all the things I've talked about. So you want to make sure that you're getting those people reflected in your sample. You want to have women and men. You want to have black people and white people. You want to have people who are of different religious backgrounds. You want to make sure that those are all represented in your sample. But again, a lot of people don't answer the phone when they don't recognize the number. So it's hard to know whether, like, if someone is more willing to answer an unknown number, are they different from people who don't answer when they don't recognize the number? I mean, it's hard to know what the differences are. There are studies that have been done that show that certain people are much more likely to answer the phone than others. And so you have to account for that. And there are ways of weighting samples, as the authors of your book talk about, to account for differences in your sample versus your population. But generally, if you get about 1,000 to 2,000 people, it's probably going to be a pretty good reflection of the broader public. But again, because so many people use cell phones and they don't answer it when they don't recognize the number, that is an issue. And it's something that polling organizations have to figure out how to deal with. Now, in terms of how you can decide, and so when you interview 1,000 to 2,000 people at random, you usually get within about 2 to 3%, maybe 4% of what the population would have said if everyone had been questioned in the population, which would be, in the United States, it'd be over 300 million people, but you're only interviewing 1,000 to 2,000. But again, if you get a good cross section, it should be a good representation. But there is what's called sampling error, which is the difference between what your sample is saying and what you would have gotten if you'd interviewed everybody. And statistically, it's within about 95% certainty that if you interview 1,000 to 2,000 people at random from a population, it's going to be within about 3 to 4% of the broader population. So, for example, if a poll was showing that, say, 55% of people in your sample said they approve of the job the president's doing in office, then if you have a 3% margin of error, then that means it's almost certainly the case that the president's popularity is somewhere between 52 to 58%, 3% on either side. So 55% of the sample say they approve. In the broader population, it could be anywhere from 52 to 58%. And that's considered to be an acceptable range of sampling measurement or error. Error doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that the survey, the sample is not going to be a 100% reflection of what the broader public would think, but it's probably going to be pretty close. The larger the sample size, the less measurement error that you have. The smaller the sample size, the greater the sampling error is. 3 to 4% is usually considered to be acceptable. But we know from recent history that polls are not always accurate in election campaigns. For example, people point to 2016 when the national polls predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the election, and of course Donald Trump won in 2016. One thing to keep in mind with that, however, is that those were national polls, and Hillary Clinton actually did win the national popular vote, but our presidential elections are determined by who wins the states, and she did not win the right states to get the number she needed to win the presidency. But in the national popular vote, the polls were showing that she would win by about 3 to 4%, and she won in the 2 to 3% range in the national popular vote. So national popular vote polls were not very far off. They were only off by 1 or 2 points, and she did win the popular vote nationally. 2020, the polls again were showing that Joe Biden would win. He did win the election, both nationally and in the Electoral College. Now, some of the state polls were off, and that was the case also in 2016, which is why people weren't picking up on the fact that Donald Trump might win the election. There are a lot of factors that go into explaining why election polls might be off. Excuse me, with regard to Donald Trump, it could be that the people more likely to support Donald Trump were less likely to want to respond to a poll because a lot of other polls that were done in, say, 2020 were relatively accurate, but the presidential election polls were still off in a number of states. So it could be a factor of just an individual factor with regard to Donald Trump, or there could be other issues, particularly the fact that so many people don't want to answer the phone, or they don't oftentimes want to answer questions. So anyway, a few things to think about with polling. Polling is not an exact science, but generally polls are a pretty good picture of the public, but it's not 100% accurate about the public, so it's just something to consider. But when people wonder, well, how can a poll be accurate if they only interview 1,000 to 2,000 people? Statistically, it can be pretty close to the general population, but there might be other factors that explain people's opinions, and polls may not always be right in that regard. So just wanted to discuss that. There are also non-scientific polls. For example, you might go to a website and they might ask your opinion about a particular political issue, and you can vote in that poll, and you can vote multiple times. Well, that's obviously not a reflection of the public. It's only reflecting people who've gone to that website, and oftentimes people can vote more than once. But a scientific poll is one where people are contacted by a polling organization either by phone or sometimes on their computer, and the polling organization using a process to get a random sample. And those are the polls that are generally most reflective of the broader public. So if you have any questions, you can always email me, and that's all I have to say on that topic. So have a great day.